The cold didn't care about Alara's reasons. It didn't care that she'd run with broken ribs still mending, or that the horse she'd taken wasn't technically stolen if the man who owned it had no right to own her first. The cold didn't give a damn about justice or fairness or the fact that she'd spent 3 years earning the right to hate someone. It just pressed down on her chest like a hand made of iron and ice, squeezing until her lungs burned and her fingers stopped working and the reins slipped from her grip entirely. The horse stumbled first. Alara felt it through her thighs. The way the animal's gait changed from steady to uncertain, from uncertain to desperate. She tried to pull back, tried to slow them down, but her hands were numb and the leather was slick, and the path they'd been following had disappeared under 6 inches of fresh snow an hour ago. "Easy," she whispered, but her voice cracked and the wind ripped the word away before it could mean anything. The horse didn't stop. It lunged forward, hooves scraping against rock hidden beneath the white, and then the wagon jolted so hard Alara's teeth clacked together. She tasted copper. The world tilted. For one impossible moment she was weightless, suspended between the sky and the ground like a piece of ash caught in an updraft. And then gravity remembered her. She hit the snow hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. For a few seconds, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except lie there with her face pressed into the cold and her chest screaming and her mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. Somewhere nearby, the horse was screaming too, a high, awful sound that cut through the wind like a blade. Alara forced herself onto her hands and knees. Her vision swam. Blood dripped from her nose onto the pristine white below, spreading in dark, ugly blossoms. She blinked hard, trying to focus, and saw the wagon 20 feet away. Its axle snapped clean in half, one wheel still spinning lazily in the air. The horse was on its side, thrashing. "No," Alara breathed. She dragged herself forward, inch by inch, her body moving on instinct because her brain wasn't working well enough to tell her this was pointless. "No, no, no!" The animal's leg was wrong, bent at an angle that made Alara's stomach twist. She'd seen enough broken things to know what that meant. The horse knew it too. It rolled its eyes at her, wild and terrified, and kept thrashing even though every movement made the injury worse. Alara's hand went to her belt, where she'd tucked the knife she'd taken from the kitchen drawer 3 nights ago. It wasn't big, barely longer than her palm, but it was sharp. She'd made sure of that before she left. She knelt beside the horse's head, her knees sinking into the snow. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the knife twice. The horse watched her, panting, its breath coming in short, panicked bursts that fogged the air between them. "I'm sorry," Alara whispered. She didn't let herself think about it. Thinking made things harder. She pressed the blade to the animal's throat, right where the pulse hammered against her fingertips, and pulled. The horse shuddered once, then stopped. Alara stayed there for a moment, her hand still on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth drain out of it into the snow. She wanted to cry, but her eyes were too dry and her body was too cold, and she didn't have the energy to waste on grief. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled, but they held. The wagon was useless now, just a pile of splintered wood and torn canvas that the wind was already starting to bury. Most of her supplies had spilled out across the snow. A bedroll, a sack of flour torn open and leaking white into white, a tin pot with a dent in the side. She grabbed what she could carry, the bedroll, a length of rope, a half-empty canteen that sloshed when she shook it, and shoved them into the canvas bag she'd been using as a pillow. Her coat was soaked through. She hadn't noticed until now, but the snow had melted against her body heat, and then refrozen, turning the wool stiff and heavy. She tried to button it, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They felt like they belonged to someone else, clumsy and useless and far away. Alara looked around. Trees rose up on all sides, their branches weighted down with snow, their trunks black against the white. The path she'd been following was gone. She couldn't even see her own tracks anymore. The wind had erased them, smoothed everything over like it had never happened. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know which way led forward and which led back. And the sun was already setting. Alara picked a direction and started walking. The thing about cold was that it lied to you. At first it hurt, bit at your fingers and toes and ears until you wanted to scream. But if you stayed in it long enough, the pain stopped. Your body went numb. You started feeling warm, even though you weren't. That's when it had you. That's when you started thinking maybe it wouldn't be so bad to just sit down for a minute. Rest your eyes. Let the snow cover you like a blanket. Ilara had heard stories about people who froze to death, how they took off their clothes at the end because they felt like they were burning up, how they smiled when they died, like they'd found something pleasant in those last few seconds. She wasn't smiling. Her teeth chattered so hard she'd bitten her tongue twice. Her legs felt like wood, stiff and awkward and slow. Every step took more effort than the last, and she kept stumbling over roots and rocks she couldn't see under the snow. The bag on her shoulder felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that hurt her ribs. But she didn't stop, because stopping meant going back. Not literally. She couldn't go back even if she wanted to. She'd burned that bridge when she'd shoved Marcus down the stairs and taken his horse and left him bleeding on the floor of the house he'd locked her inside for 3 years. But stopping meant letting him win. It meant all of this. The running, the fear, the frozen horse bleeding out in the snow. It meant all of it was for nothing. And Ilara Voss would rather die than let it be for nothing. The trees thinned out. She found herself on a ridge, the ground sloping down into darkness on one side and up into more darkness on the other. The wind hit her full force here, no branches to break it, and she staggered sideways, nearly losing her footing. Something moved in the distance. Ilara froze. Her hand went to the knife at her belt, still there, still sticky with the horse's blood. She squinted into the gray, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A shape. Too big to be a person. Too solid to be a trick of the light. It moved again, closer this time. A bear, maybe. Or a wolf. Something that saw her the way she'd seen the horse. Wounded, weak, easy prey. Ilara pulled the knife free. Her hand shook. The blade looked small and stupid in the failing light, and she knew it wouldn't do a damn thing if whatever was out there decided to come for her. But it was all she had, so she held it anyway. The shape kept coming, not fast, not charging, just steady, like it had all the time in the world. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Wanted to scream, but her throat was too dry. So she just stood there, gripping the knife, watching the thing get closer and closer until it wasn't a bear. It was a man. Massive, broad-shouldered, dressed in furs that made him look even bigger than he already was. He carried something over one shoulder, a rifle, maybe, or an axe, and he walked like the snow didn't bother him at all, like he was part of it. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at her. Ilara looked back. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The wind howled between them, and for a long moment, the only sound was the creaking of the trees and the rasp of Ilara's breathing. Then the man spoke. "You lost." His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it much. Ilara's grip on the knife tightened. "No," she lied. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. His face was hard to make out in the dimness, just a silhouette framed by fur and shadow. But she could feel his gaze on her, heavy and measuring. "You're bleeding," he said. Ilara touched her nose. Her fingers came away red. She'd forgotten about that. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not. I don't need your help." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted the thing on his shoulder. It was an axe she saw now, the blade gleaming dully in the last of the light, and took a step forward. Ilara raised the knife. "Don't." He stopped, looked at the blade, looked at her. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face, but it was gone too fast to be sure. "That's not going to do much," he said. "It'll do enough." "Will it?" Ilara didn't answer. Her arm was starting to shake from holding the knife up, and she knew he could see it. Knew he was deciding right now whether she was worth the trouble or not. Finally, he sighed, a low, tired sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Suit yourself," he said. He turned and started walking away, back the way he'd come. Ilara stared after him. Her brain screamed at her to move, to follow, to do something other than stand here like an idiot while the only person she'd seen in days disappeared into the storm. But her pride, stubborn, stupid, unbreakable, kept her feet planted. She lasted about 30 seconds. "Wait." The man stopped, didn't turn around, just stood there, waiting. Ilara lowered the knife. Her throat felt tight. "How far is the nearest town?" 2 days, the man said. If you don't freeze first, and if I do freeze, he turned then, just enough that she could see his face in profile, then you'll be a lot easier to bury. Alara almost laughed. It came out as a cough instead, wet and painful. She pressed a hand to her ribs and felt something shift under her coat, something wrong. The fall from the wagon had done more damage than she'd thought. The man watched her for another moment. Then he sighed again. "There's a cabin," he said, "half a mile south. You can make it that far if you move." "Why would you help me?" "I'm not." He adjusted the axe on his shoulder. "But if you die out here, the wolves will make a mess, and I'll have to clean it up. So do us both a favor and stay alive until morning." He started walking again. This time, Alara followed. The cabin was smaller than she'd expected. It sat in a clearing surrounded by pines, its roof heavy with snow, smoke rising from a chimney that looked like it had been patched more than once. A single window glowed with firelight, warm and orange against the gathering dark. It looked like the kind of place you saw in storybooks: the witch's cottage, the hunter's lodge, the last stop before the world ended. Alara's legs gave out on the porch. She didn't mean to fall. One second she was standing, the next she was on her knees, the bag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the wood with a dull thud. Her vision swam. The cold pressed down on her from all sides, and suddenly she couldn't remember why she'd been fighting it so hard. The man crouched in front of her. Up close, she could see his face properly for the first time. Scarred, weathered, older than she'd thought. His eyes were pale, almost colorless in the firelight. They didn't look kind, but they didn't look cruel either, just tired. "Can you stand?" he asked. Alara tried. Her legs wobbled, buckled. She would have fallen again if he hadn't caught her. His hands were huge. They wrapped around her arms like vices, holding her up without any visible effort. Alara wanted to pull away, wanted to tell him not to touch her, but her body wasn't listening anymore. "I've got you," the man said, and then everything went black. That's it. When Alara woke up, she was warm. That was the first thing she noticed, the heat soaking into her skin, chasing away the numbness that had settled in her bones. The second thing she noticed was the pain. Her ribs throbbed with every breath. Her head felt like someone had taken an axe to it. Her fingers and toes burned as the feeling came back into them, sharp and relentless. She opened her eyes. She was lying on a bed, or something like it, a wooden frame with a mattress that smelled like pine needles and smoke. A blanket had been tucked around her, heavy and rough. The room was small, lit by a single lantern hanging from a hook on the wall. She could hear the fire crackling somewhere nearby, and the wind howling outside, and nothing else. Alara sat up. The world tilted, and she had to grab the edge of the bed to keep from falling over. Her coat was gone. So were her boots. She was still wearing her dress, soaked through and filthy, but someone had draped another blanket over her shoulders. Someone. The man was sitting by the fire, his back to her. He'd taken off the furs and the axe, and without them he looked almost normal. Almost. He was still massive, shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, arms thick with muscle and old scars. His hair was dark and unkempt, long enough to brush his collar. He didn't move, didn't turn around, but Alara knew he'd heard her wake up. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice came out as a croak. "My cabin," the man said. "Where's my bag?" "By the door." Alara looked. He was right. Her bag was sitting on the floor next to a pair of boots that weren't hers. Everything she'd managed to salvage from the wagon was still there, including the knife. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said. "No," the man agreed. "I didn't." "Then why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, picked up a tin cup from the hearth, and turned to face her. "Because you would have died." "Maybe I wanted to." The man crossed the room and held out the cup. Steam rose from it, carrying the smell of something bitter and herbal. "Drink this." Alara didn't move. "What is it?" "Tea. It'll help with the cold." "I don't want your tea." The man's jaw tightened. He set the cup on the small table beside the bed and stepped back. "Fine. Freeze from the inside out. See if I care." He turned and walked back to the fire, lowering himself into the chair with a weariness that made him seem older than he probably was. Alara watched him for a moment, her pride warring with her common sense. Her hands were still shaking. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She picked up the cup. The tea was terrible, bitter and sharp, with an aftertaste that made her nose wrinkle. But it was hot, and heat was what she needed, so she drank it anyway. By the time she'd finished, the shaking had stopped. "Thank you," she said quietly. The man grunted. It wasn't quite an acknowledgement, but it was close enough. Alara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What's your name?" He didn't answer right away. She thought maybe he wasn't going to, and then, "Rowan." "Rowan," she repeated. It was a good name, strong, simple. It fit him. "I'm Alara." "I know." She frowned. "How?" "You said it when I brought you in. You kept saying it over and over. I'm Ilara Voss, I'm Alara Voss, like you were trying to convince yourself." Heat crept into Alara's cheeks. She didn't remember that, didn't remember anything after collapsing on the porch. The fact that she'd been talking, saying her name like some kind of desperate prayer made her stomach twist. "I didn't ask you to save me," she said. "You didn't have to." "I don't need saving." Rowan turned to look at her then, his pale eyes flat and unimpressed. "You were half dead in the snow with broken ribs and no supplies. What do you call that?" "Bad luck." "Bad choices." Alara's hands curled into fists under the blanket. "You don't know anything about me." "Don't need to," Rowan said. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're running from something, or someone. You took a horse that probably wasn't yours, packed light, and headed into the mountains in the middle of winter without a guide or a map. That's not bad luck. That's desperation." Alara's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck. "So here's how this is going to work," Rowan continued. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was explaining the rules of a game. "You can stay here until the storm passes. 3 days, maybe 4. After that, you leave. I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here." "I don't want to stay here." "Good. Then we understand each other." Alara looked away, her jaw tight. The fire crackled in the silence between them. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. "What if I leave now?" she asked. Rowan shrugged. "You'll die. But that's your choice." "You'd let me?" "It's not my job to stop you." Alara laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You really don't give a damn, do you?" "No," Rowan said simply. "I don't." And somehow, that honesty was worse than cruelty. Mom. The first night was the hardest. Alara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's face, the way it had twisted with rage when she'd shoved him, the way he'd grabbed for her even as he fell, like he could drag her down with him. She heard his voice in her head, low and venomous. "You think you can leave me? You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" She'd believed him for 3 years, believed that no one would help her, that there was no point in running, that she deserved what he gave her because she'd been stupid enough to trust him in the first place. And maybe she had been stupid. Maybe she still was. But she'd run anyway. And now she was here, lying in a stranger's bed, in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, with broken ribs and no plan and no idea what came next. It should have felt like failure. It should have felt like the end. Instead, it felt like the first real breath she'd taken in years. Rowan didn't sleep either. Or if he did, Alara didn't see it. He stayed by the fire all night, feeding it logs from a stack by the door, occasionally getting up to check the window or adjust the blanket he'd draped over the back of his chair. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her presence except to refill her cup when it was empty. It should have been uncomfortable. The silence, the tension, the unspoken weight of everything neither of them was saying. But it wasn't. It was just quiet. Alara wasn't used to quiet. Marcus had always filled the silence, with words, with orders, with the sound of his footsteps on the stairs when he came home late and angry. The house had never been still, never been safe. But here, in this cabin, the silence felt different. It felt like space, like permission to exist without having to explain herself. She wasn't sure what to do with it. By the time the sky started to lighten, a pale, grudging gray that barely counted as dawn, Alara had managed a few hours of fitful sleep. She woke to the smell of something cooking and the sound of metal scraping against metal. Rowan was at the stove, stirring something in a cast iron pot. He glanced at her when she sat up, but didn't say anything. "What is that?" Elara asked. "Porridge. It smells terrible." "It tastes worse." He ladled some into a bowl and held it out. "Eat it anyway." Elara took the bowl. He wasn't lying. The porridge was bland and gritty, with a texture that made her think of wet sand. But it was food, and her stomach was empty, so she ate it. Rowan watched her for a moment, then turned back to the stove. "You didn't sleep much." "Neither did you." "I'm used to it." Elara set the bowl down. "Do you always live like this? Alone?" "Yes." "Why?" Rowan's hand stilled on the ladle. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because it's easier." "Easier than what?" "Than the alternative." Elara didn't push. She recognized that tone, the one that said, "This conversation is over, don't ask again." She'd used it herself often enough. They ate in silence. When they were finished, Rowan took the bowls and set them in a basin by the door. "Your ribs are broken," he said, not looking at her. "At least 2, maybe 3. You need to wrap them." "I know." "Can you do it yourself?" Elara hesitated. She wanted to say yes, wanted to prove she didn't need his help, didn't need anyone's help. But the truth was, she could barely lift her arms without wincing. "No," she admitted. Rowan nodded. He crossed the room and pulled a roll of cloth from a cupboard, then set it on the table beside the bed. "I'll do it, but you're going to have to take off your dress." Elara's stomach twisted. "No?" "Then you're going to suffocate when the swelling gets worse." "I'll manage." Rowan's expression didn't change. "Suit yourself." He turned and walked back to the fire, leaving the cloth on the table. Elara stared at it, her heart pounding. She knew he was right, knew the ribs needed to be wrapped or they'd heal wrong, or not heal at all. But the thought of undressing in front of him, of letting him touch her, made her skin crawl. Not because she thought he'd hurt her. She didn't know why she was so sure of that, but she was. Rowan didn't look at her the way Marcus had, like she was something to own, to use. He looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't asked for. And somehow that made it worse, because it meant she couldn't hate him. "Fine," Elara said finally. She stood, ignoring the way her ribs screamed in protest, and started unbuttoning her dress. Her hands shook, but she forced them to keep moving. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," Rowan said flatly. He didn't turn around. "Tell me when you're ready." Elara let the dress fall to the floor. She was left in her underthings, a thin chemise that was more holes than fabric, stained with blood and dirt. She crossed her arms over her chest and sat back down on the bed. "Ready," she said. Rowan turned. His face was impassive as he picked up the cloth and crossed the room. He knelt in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, and gestured for her to lift her arms. She did. He worked quickly, efficiently, wrapping the cloth around her torso with practiced hands. His touch was firm, but not rough, and he kept his eyes on what he was doing, never once letting his gaze drift. When he was finished, he tied off the end and stepped back. "That should hold," he said. Elara pulled her dress back on, her face burning. "Thank you." Rowan didn't respond. He just picked up the leftover cloth and put it back in the cupboard, then returned to his chair by the fire. And that was that. The days passed slowly. The storm didn't let up. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls, and the wind howled like something feral, rattling the shutters and making the walls creak. Rowan went outside once a day to check the traps he'd set and bring in more firewood, but otherwise they stayed inside. Elara wasn't used to being still. At first she tried to help, offered to cook, to clean, to do something other than sit on the bed and stare at the walls. But Rowan waved her off. "You're injured," he said. "Rest." "I can still work." "You'll make it worse." "I don't care." Rowan looked at her then, his pale eyes sharp. "I do. You collapse again, I'm the one who has to deal with it. So sit down and don't be stupid." Elara sat. But she hated it. Hated the feeling of uselessness, of being a burden. Hated the way Rowan moved around the cabin like she wasn't there, tending the fire and mending his traps, and doing all the things she should have been able to do herself. On the third day, she couldn't take it anymore. "Let me help," she said. Rowan didn't look up from the trap he was fixing. No. Why not? Because you'll hurt yourself. I'm not fragile. Didn't say you were. He set the trap aside and reached for another one. But you're hurt. There's a difference. Elara clenched her jaw. I need to do something. Then sleep. I can't. Rowan finally looked at her. His expression was unreadable. Why not? Elara opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know how to answer that. Didn't know how to explain that every time she closed her eyes, she heard Marcus's voice. That she kept expecting him to find her, to drag her back, to make good on all the things he'd promised he'd do if she ever tried to leave. Nightmares, she said finally. Rowan studied her for a moment. Then he nodded, like that made sense. You can mend this, he said, holding out the trap. But if you rip your stitches, don't blame me. Elara took the trap. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold and rough against her palms. I don't have stitches. You will if you keep pushing yourself. Despite everything, Elara almost smiled. By the fourth day, the storm had started to ease. The wind wasn't howling anymore, and the snow had stopped falling long enough for the sun to break through the clouds, a pale, watery light that made the world outside look almost beautiful. Rowan stood by the window, staring out at it, his expression unreadable. Storm's over, he said. Elara's stomach dropped. So I leave tomorrow. Yes. She didn't know why that bothered her. She'd been counting the days, waiting for the moment she could get out of here and put this whole thing behind her. But now that it was here, she felt unsettled. Where will you go? Rowan asked. Elara shrugged. I don't know. West, maybe. Somewhere far enough that he won't find me. He'll find you. Her hands tightened on the blanket. You don't know that. I do. Rowan turned to face her. Men like him always do. They don't give up. They don't move on. They just keep coming until you stop them. And how do I do that? You don't run. Elara laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Easy for you to say. It's not easy, Rowan said. His voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something raw and old. It's never easy, but running doesn't fix anything. It just makes the chase longer. Elara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his face she hadn't noticed before. Pain, regret, the kind of scars that didn't show on skin. You ran, she said. Didn't you? Rowan's jaw tightened. He turned back to the window and didn't answer, but Elara knew she was right. Elara left the next morning before the sun was fully up. She'd packed her bag the night before, what little she had left. The bedroll, the rope, the canteen Rowan had refilled from the well behind the cabin. He'd added a few things without asking, a pouch of dried meat, a tin of matches wrapped in oilcloth, a wool scarf that smelled like wood smoke. She'd wanted to refuse them, but her pride wasn't worth freezing to death a second time. Rowan was already awake when she came out of the back room. He was standing by the stove, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He held one out to her without a word. Elara took it. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and the warmth spread through her chest like a small fire. They stood there in the early gray light, not speaking, just drinking. Finally, Rowan set his cup down. You know where you're going? West, Elara said. There's a town, maybe 2 days if the weather holds. 3, Rowan corrected, and that's if you don't get lost. I won't get lost. You will. He crossed to the table and unrolled a piece of paper, a rough map, hand-drawn, the lines faded and smudged. Follow the ridge south until you hit the river, then go west along the water. Don't leave the riverbank, even if it looks like there's a shorter path. There isn't. Elara studied the map, committing it to memory. You drew this? Years ago. Why? Rowan rolled the map back up and handed it to her. Because I got lost once, nearly died. Figured I'd save someone else the trouble. Elara tucked the map into her bag. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Rowan picked up his coat from the back of the chair and shrugged it on. I'll walk you to the ridge. After that, you're on your own. You don't have to. I know. He grabbed the rifle from beside the door and stepped outside. Elara followed, pulling the scarf tight around her neck. The cold hit her like a fist, but it wasn't as brutal as it had been a week ago. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under fresh snow that glittered in the weak morning light. The sky was clear for the first time since she'd arrived, pale blue, stretched thin, infinite. They walked in silence. Rowan moved through the snow like it was nothing, his boots crunching in a steady rhythm. Alara struggled to keep up, her ribs aching with every step, but she didn't complain. She'd survived worse. She'd survived this too. The ridge wasn't far, maybe half a mile. But by the time they reached it, Alara's lungs were burning, and her legs felt like they'd been hollowed out. She stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a tree, and Rowan stopped beside her. From here, she could see the valley stretching out below, endless white broken only by the dark line of the river cutting through it like a scar. Beyond that, more mountains, more trees, more cold. "That's your path," Rowan said, nodding toward the river. "Stay with it. Don't stop until you reach the town." Alara nodded. Her throat felt tight, and she didn't trust herself to speak. Rowan shifted the rifle on his shoulder. "You know he's going to come after you." It wasn't a question. "I know," Alara said quietly, "and you're still going." "I don't have a choice." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something small and metallic, a pocket watch, old and tarnished. He held it out. "What's this?" Alara asked. "Insurance," Rowan said. "You get to town, find a man named Fletcher, runs the general store. Show him this. Tell him I sent you. He'll help you." Alara took the watch. It was heavier than it looked, the metal warm from being close to Rowan's body. "Why would he help me?" "Because he owes me." "For what?" Rowan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "That's between me and him." Alara closed her fingers around the watch. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know why he was doing this, why he cared at all. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with everything else she couldn't say. "Thank you," she managed finally. Rowan nodded. Then he turned and started walking back toward the cabin, his figure growing smaller against the white until he disappeared into the trees. Alara stood there for another minute, the watch heavy in her palm. Then she tucked it into her pocket, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and started down the ridge toward the river. She didn't look back. The first day wasn't bad. The sun stayed out, weak but steady, and the river was easy to follow. Alara kept a careful pace, stopping every hour to rest and check the map. Her ribs hurt, but the wrapping Rowan had done held firm, and as long as she didn't move too quickly, the pain was manageable. She saw no one, heard nothing but the wind and the crunch of her own footsteps, and the occasional crack of ice breaking somewhere downstream. It should have been lonely. Instead, it felt like freedom. By the time the sun started to set, Alara had made good progress. She found a spot where the trees grew close to the water, thick enough to block the wind, and made camp. She didn't risk a fire. Rowan had warned her about that. Smoke could be seen for miles, and she didn't know who might be watching. She ate a piece of the dried meat, drank from the canteen, and wrapped herself in the bedroll. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound made her flinch, the snap of a branch, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. She kept one hand on the knife and the other tucked under her chin, and eventually exhaustion dragged her under. She dreamed of Marcus. He was standing in the doorway of the house, backlit by the setting sun, his face in shadow. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been yelling. In the dream, she couldn't move, couldn't run. She just stood there, frozen, while he walked toward her step by step by step. She woke up gasping, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. The sky was still dark. The fire... No, there was no fire. She was outside. She was safe. She pressed a hand to her chest and counted her breaths until they slowed. Then she sat up, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and waited for the sun. Done. The second day was harder. The sky clouded over by mid-morning and the temperature dropped. Alara's fingers went numb inside her gloves, and the scarf Rowan had given her was the only thing keeping the wind from flaying the skin off her face. She kept moving, kept following the river, but every step felt like dragging herself through mud. By afternoon, the snow started again. Not heavy, just a thin, steady fall that clung to her coat and melted against her skin. She pulled the map out twice to check her progress, but the landmarks Rowan had drawn were hard to make out under the fresh snow. She thought she was still on the right path. She hoped she was. When the light started to fade, she looked for another place to camp. But the trees here were sparser, the ground more exposed, and she couldn't find anywhere that felt safe. So she kept walking, even though her legs were shaking and her ribs felt like they were grinding together with every breath. She almost missed the cabin. It was set back from the river, half hidden by a stand of pines. The roof had caved in on one side, and the door hung crooked on its hinges, but it was shelter. Elara stumbled toward it, her vision blurring at the edges, and pushed the door open. The inside was a mess. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, rotted wood, something that might have been a saddle once. But one corner was intact, and there was enough roof left to keep the snow out. Elara dropped her bag, sank down against the wall, and closed her eyes. She'd rest for an hour, maybe 2. Then she'd keep moving. She woke up to the sound of voices. Her eyes snapped open. It was still dark, or dark again, she wasn't sure. The voices were outside, low and muffled by the wind. Men. At least 2 of them. Alara's hand went to the knife. She pressed herself flatter against the wall, hardly daring to breathe, and listened. "Nothing out here," one of the men was saying. His voice was rough, irritated. "We've been walking for hours. This is a waste of time." "Shut up," the second man said. His voice was quieter, but there was an edge to it that made Alara's stomach twist. He said she came this way. "We keep looking." "And what if she's already dead? What if the cold got her?" "Then we bring back a body." Alara's heart stopped. They were looking for her. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The voices grew louder, closer, and then she heard footsteps crunching through the snow just outside the cabin. The beam of a lantern swept across the broken door, spilling light into the room. "Check inside," the second man said. Alara's grip tightened on the knife. If they came in, she'd have to fight, and she'd lose. She knew that. But she wasn't going back. Not alive. The footsteps stopped at the door. The lantern beam moved across the floor, illuminating the debris, the broken furniture, the corner where Alara was crouched in shadow. "It's empty," the first man said. "Let's go." "Wait!" Alara's pulse roared in her ears. The light moved closer, sweeping toward her corner. Another few seconds and they'd see her. She shifted, ready to spring, ready to... "Forget it," the first man said. "My place is falling apart. No one's here." The light pulled back. The footsteps moved away. Alara stayed frozen, barely breathing, until the voices faded into the distance and the night swallowed them whole. Then she let out a shaky breath and pressed her forehead against her knees. They were hunting her. Marcus had sent them. And they were close. Alara forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled, but they held. She grabbed her bag, slipped out the back of the cabin where the wall had collapsed, and melted into the trees. She didn't stop walking until dawn. By the time she reached the town, Alara was barely standing. It wasn't much. A scattering of buildings clustered around a wide dirt road, most of them dark. A church with a crooked steeple. A stable. A building with a faded sign that read, "Fletcher's General Store." Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but the streets were empty. Alara made her way to the store. Her hands shook as she pushed the door open, and a bell chimed somewhere overhead. The inside was warm and smelled like coffee and sawdust. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods and bolts of fabric and things Alara hadn't seen in years. A man stood behind the counter, older with gray hair and a lined face. He looked up when she came in, and his eyes narrowed. "We're closed," he said. "Are you Fletcher?" Alara asked. Her voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The man studied her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" Alara pulled the pocket watch from her coat and set it on the counter. "Rowan Cade sent me." Fletcher's expression changed. He picked up the watch, turning it over in his hands, and let out a low whistle. "I'll be damned." He looked at her again, really looked this time, and his face softened. "You're in trouble." "Yes." "Bad trouble?" "Yes." Fletcher nodded. He tucked the watch into his pocket and gestured toward the back of the store. "Come on, let's get you out of sight." He led her through a narrow doorway into a small back room. There was a cot in one corner, a stove in the other, and a table piled high with papers and ledgers. Fletcher pulled out a chair and nodded for her to sit. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. Alara tried to remember. Yesterday, maybe. Fletcher grunted and turned to the stove. He ladled something from a pot into a bowl and set it in front of her. Stew, thick and steaming. Alara's stomach clenched at the smell, and she realized just how hungry she was. She ate without tasting it, shoveling the food into her mouth until the bowl was empty. Fletcher watched her in silence, his arms crossed. "Rowan doesn't send people my way often," he said finally. "Last time was 5 years ago. Man owed money to the wrong people. I helped him disappear." "What happened to him?" Alara asked. "Don't know. Never saw him again." Fletcher leaned against the table. "So what's your story?" Alara set the spoon down. "I'm running from someone." "Figured that much." "Who?" "A man named Marcus Hale." Fletcher's face went still. "Hale? You know him?" "Of him." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "He's got a reputation, not a good one." "He's coming for me," Alara said. "He sent men. They were close, maybe a day behind." Fletcher swore under his breath. "You can't stay here. He's got connections. If he finds out you're in town—" "I know." Alara's voice was flat. "I just need supplies. Food, a coat. Then I'll leave. And go where?" "I don't know." Fletcher shook his head. "Running won't work. You can't outrun a man like Hale. He'll just keep sending people until one of them catches you." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "There's a woman. Name's Ada. She lives on the edge of town. Helps people who need to disappear. People the law won't touch. She might be able to get you out of the territory." "How?" "Don't know. Don't ask. She's got her ways." He straightened and pulled a scrap of paper from the table, scribbling something on it. "Go to this address. Tell her I sent you. And for the love of everything, don't let anyone see you." Alara took the paper. Her hands were still shaking. "Why are you helping me?" Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. "Because Rowan asked, and because I've got a daughter. If she ever needed help and I wasn't there, I'd want someone to do the same." Alara's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Fletcher handed her a sack, food, a blanket, a heavy coat that was too big but warm. "Go now, before someone sees you, and be careful." Alara slung the sack over her shoulder and headed for the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back. "Thank you." Fletcher waved her off. "Don't thank me yet. Just stay alive." Ada's house was at the far end of town, tucked behind a grove of bare trees. It was small and plain, with peeling paint and shutters that didn't quite close. Alara knocked twice and waited. The door opened a crack. A woman peered out, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. "What do you want?" "Fletcher sent me," Alara said. She held up the paper. Ada's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Alara's face. "You're the one running from Hale. How did you—" "Word travels." Ada opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Get in, quickly." Alara slipped inside. The house was warm and cluttered, every surface covered with books and papers and strange little trinkets. Ada shut the door and locked it, then turned to face her. "You're either very brave or very stupid," Ada said. "Which is it?" "I don't know," Alara said honestly. Ada smiled, a thin, sharp expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Honesty's a start." She gestured toward a chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." So Alara did. She told her about Marcus, about the 3 years she'd spent in that house, feeling the walls close in a little more every day. About the night she'd finally snapped, the way he'd looked at her when she'd pushed him, the sound his body had made hitting the floor. She told her about the wagon, the storm, Rowan, the men hunting her, all of it. When she was finished, Ada was quiet for a long time. "He'll kill you if he catches you," Ada said finally. "I know." "The law won't help. He's got people in his pocket. Judges, sheriffs. They'll side with him." "I know that too." Ada leaned back in her chair, studying Alara with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "So what do you want from me?" "Fletcher said you could help me disappear." "I can." Ada's smile returned, sharper this time. "But it'll cost you." "I don't have any money." "I don't want money." Ada stood and crossed to the window, peering out through the shutters. I want something else. A promise. Alara's stomach tightened. What kind of promise? That you'll fight. Ada turned back to face her. I can get you papers, new identity, passage on a wagon heading east. But none of that matters if you keep running. Men like hail. They don't stop because you disappear. They stop because you make them. I don't know how to do that. You learn. Ada crossed her arms. Or you die. Those are your options. Alara stared at her. She wanted to argue, to say there had to be another way, but deep down she knew Ada was right. Running had bought her time, but it hadn't bought her freedom, and it never would. Okay, Alara said quietly. I'll fight. Ada's smile widened. Good. Then let's get started. What? Alara spent the next 3 days at Ada's house, hidden away while Ada worked her connections. She learned that Ada wasn't just some woman on the edge of town. She was part of a network, a loose collection of people who helped women escape bad situations. Women like Alara. Most of them don't make it, Ada said one night over cups of bitter tea. They run, they hide, but they never really leave. The fear follows them. It gets inside and festers until they can't tell the difference between the past and the present. How do you stop it? Alara asked. You don't. Ada set her cup down. You just learn to live with it, and you make sure the bastard who put it there pays. On the third day, Ada came to her with a bundle of papers, travel documents, a letter of introduction, and a ticket for a wagon heading east. This will get you to the next territory, Ada said. After that, you're on your own. Alara looked at the papers, her chest tight. What about Marcus? What about him? He'll keep looking. Let him. Ada's eyes were hard. You're not his to find anymore. Alara wanted to believe that. She really did. But as she tucked the papers into her bag, all she could think about was the men in the woods, their voices cutting through the dark. The way they'd said they'd bring back a body if they had to. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the street outside, and thought about Rowan. About the way he'd looked at her that last morning, like he'd known she wasn't ready but was letting her go anyway. She wondered if he'd meant it. What he'd said about running making the chase longer. She wondered if she'd ever stop running at all. Just before dawn, there was a knock at the door. Ada opened it, and Alara's heart stopped. It was Fletcher. His face was pale, his expression grim. He's here, Fletcher said. Marcus Hale. He rode in an hour ago with 3 men. They're asking about a woman matching Alara's description. Ada swore. How long do we have? Not long. They're going door to door. Alara stood, her hands shaking. I have to leave. You can't, Ada said. They'll see you. Then what do I do? Ada and Fletcher exchanged a look. Then Ada turned back to Alara, her face set. You stay here, and when they come, you don't hide. What? You face him, Ada said. You look him in the eye, and you tell him no. In front of witnesses, in front of the whole damn town if you have to. Alara's stomach twisted. He'll kill me. Maybe. Ada's voice was hard. Or maybe he won't. Because the one thing men like him can't stand is being told no in public. It takes their power away. Fletcher nodded. She's right. If you run now, you'll be running forever. But if you face him, if you make him back down in front of people, it changes everything. Alara looked between them. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything but what they were suggesting. But then she thought about the cabin in the woods, about Rowan's voice, low and steady. Running doesn't fix anything. It just makes the chase longer. Okay, Alara said. Her voice shook, but she said it anyway. Okay, I'll do it. Ada smiled. Good girl. Did. They came an hour later. Alara heard them before she saw them. The heavy thud of boots on the porch, the low murmur of voices. Ada opened the door before they could knock, her face calm, her posture easy. Can I help you, gentlemen? She asked. There were 4 of them. 3 she didn't recognize. Hired muscle, big and mean-looking. But the 4th, Alara's breath caught. Marcus Hale stood at the front, tall and broad-shouldered, his face as handsome and cold as she remembered. He looked older somehow, lines carved deeper around his mouth and eyes. But his gaze was the same, sharp, calculating, dangerous. We're looking for someone, Marcus said. His voice was smooth, pleasant, the kind of voice that made you want to trust him. A woman, dark hair, about this tall. He held up a hand. She may be injured. Lots of women fit that description, Ada said. Marcus smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. This one's special. She's my wife. Alara stepped forward before she could stop herself. She moved into the doorway beside Ada, her chin up, her hands clenched at her sides. I'm not your wife, she said. Marcus's smile widened. Alara. He said her name like a caress, like they were the only two people in the world. There you are. I've been so worried. I'm not going back. Of course you are. His tone didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark and hungry. You're not well. You've been through a lot. But I'm here now. I'll take care of you. No. The word hung in the air between them. Around them, people had started to gather, curious neighbors drawn by the commotion. Alara could feel their eyes on her, could hear their whispers. Marcus's smile finally cracked. Alara, don't be difficult. I'm not being difficult, Alara said. Her voice was stronger now, louder. I'm telling you, I'm not going back. I don't belong to you. I never did. Marcus took a step forward. Ada moved to block him, but he ignored her, his eyes locked on Alara. You think these people will help you? You think they care? They don't even know you. They don't have to, Alara said. I know me, and I know I'd rather die out here than spend one more day in that house with you. Something in Marcus's face changed. The charm dropped away, replaced by something colder. You ungrateful? She said no. The voice came from behind them. Alara turned and her heart stopped. Rowan Cade stepped out of the crowd, his rifle slung over one shoulder, his pale eyes fixed on Marcus. This doesn't concern you, Marcus said. It does now, Rowan said. He moved to stand beside Alara, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. She's not going anywhere. Marcus looked between them, his jaw tight. For a moment, Alara thought he'd back down. Then he smiled again, sharp and ugly. You're making a mistake, he said. All of you. Maybe, Rowan said, but it's ours to make. Marcus stared at him for another long moment. Then he turned and walked away, his men following. But as he reached the edge of the porch, he looked back at Alara one last time. This isn't over, he said. And then he was gone. Alara's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Rowan hadn't caught her, his hands steady on her arms. She looked up at him, her vision blurring. You came back, she whispered. Yeah, Rowan said. I did. The crowd didn't disperse right away. They stood there watching, a dozen faces Alara didn't know, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to something that might have been pity. She hated that last one most of all. Ada cleared her throat. Show's over, folks. Go on home. They left slowly, reluctantly, like they were disappointed there hadn't been more violence. Alara stayed where she was, Rowan's hand still steadying her, her heart still trying to hammer its way out of her chest. Come on, Ada said. Let's get you inside before you pass out. Rowan helped her back into the house. Her legs felt like they'd been carved from wet wood, and her ribs were screaming again, but she made it to the chair without collapsing. Ada shut the door and locked it, then turned to face Rowan. You've got terrible timing, she said. Seemed pretty good to me, Rowan replied. How'd you even know she was here? Fletcher sent word. Rowan leaned his rifle against the wall and pulled off his gloves. Said there was trouble coming. Figured I should see it through. Alara looked up at him. You didn't have to do that. I know. Then why did you? Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his elbows on his knees. Because you're not a quitter. And I didn't want to see you quit now. Alara's throat tightened. She wanted to say something. Thank you, maybe, or I'm not worth this. But the words tangled up before they could reach her mouth. Ada moved to the stove and started making coffee. He'll be back, she said, not looking at either of them. Marcus Hale doesn't strike me as the type to let something like this go. He's not, Alara said quietly. He'll find a way. He always does. Then we make sure you're ready when he comes, Ada said. She poured 3 cups and set them on the table. No more running, no more hiding. You face him head on, or you lose. I don't know how to do that. You just did it, Rowan said. Out there, in front of everyone. That was different. You were there. Ada was there. If I'd been alone, you wouldn't have been alone, Ada interrupted. That's the point. He thrives on isolation, on making you think you're the only one who sees what he really is. But now the town knows. They saw him. They heard you say no. That changes things. Elara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. He said it wasn't over. It's not, Rowan said bluntly. He'll come back with something worse. Legal papers, maybe. Claims of theft or abandonment. Something that puts the law on his side. Can he do that? If he's got the right connections, yeah. Ada nodded. Men like Hale always have a plan B, and it usually involves making you look like the criminal. Elara's stomach twisted. She'd thought about this, late at night when she couldn't sleep, when Marcus's voice echoed in her head. The accusations he could make, the lies he could tell. She'd taken his horse, she'd pushed him down the stairs. In the eyes of the law, she was the one who'd broken the rules. So what do I do? She asked. Ada sat down at the table, her expression sharp. You build your case. Get witnesses, people who'll testify to what he did to you. No one will believe me. Maybe not. But they don't have to believe you. They just have to doubt him. Ada leaned forward. You're not the first woman he's done this to. I'd bet my life on it. Men like him don't wake up one day and decide to be monsters. They practice. And if he practiced, there are others. Elara hadn't thought of that. The idea sent a cold shiver down her spine. How do I find them? You start asking questions, Ada said. Where he came from, who he knew, what happened to the people who crossed him. She paused. And you let me help. I've got connections, people who owe me favors. We can dig. Rowan set his cup down. And while you're digging, I'll make sure he doesn't get close to her again. Elara looked at him. You can't stay here. You've got your own life. My life's a cabin in the woods where I talk to myself and pretend I'm fine with it, Rowan said flatly. Trust me, this is more interesting. Despite everything, Elara almost smiled. All right, Ada said. She stood and started gathering papers from the cluttered shelves. We've got work to do, and not much time to do it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Ada sent letters to contacts in neighboring towns, asking about Marcus Hale's past. Fletcher kept watch on the streets, reporting back whenever Marcus or his men made an appearance. And Rowan stayed close. He didn't hover, didn't crowd her, but he was always there. A presence in the corner of the room, a shadow at her back. Elara tried to be useful. She helped Ada organize the papers, wrote down everything she could remember about Marcus, names, dates, places. It wasn't much. He'd kept her isolated, cut off from anyone who might have helped. But there were pieces. A woman he'd mentioned once, someone who'd worked for him years ago and left suddenly. A business partner who'd disappeared after a disagreement. It's not enough, Elara said on the second night, staring at the notes spread across the table. We need proof. Real proof. We'll find it, Ada said, but her voice was less certain than usual. Elara rubbed her eyes. She was exhausted, bone-deep tired, in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. What if we don't? Then we improvise. That's not a plan. It's the only plan we've got. Rowan walked in from outside, stamping snow off his boots. He's making moves, he said without preamble. Talked to the sheriff this morning, filed a complaint. Elara's stomach dropped. What kind of complaint? Theft, assault. Says you attacked him and stole his property. Rowan pulled off his coat and hung it by the door. Sheriff's not buying it yet, but he's listening. Of course he is, Elara said bitterly. Marcus probably paid him. Maybe. Or maybe the sheriff's just doing his job. Rowan crossed to the table and looked at the papers. Either way, we need to move faster. Ada tapped her fingers on the table. There's one person who might know something. A woman named Claire Dunn. She worked as Marcus's housekeeper about 5 years back. Left town in a hurry. Where is she now? Elara asked. Last I heard, she was living in Ridgewood. It's about a day's ride east. Rowan frowned. That's too far. If Marcus finds out we're looking for her, he won't, Ada said. Not if we're careful. She looked at Elara. You up for a trip? Elara's ribs still ached. Her body still felt like it had been put through a grinder, but she nodded anyway. Yes. Good, Ada said. You leave at first light. Rowan goes with you. Rowan didn't argue. He just nodded and started checking his rifle. They left before the sun was up, the sky still dark and heavy with the promise of more snow. Ada had packed them supplies, food, blankets, a map. Fletcher loaned them 2 horses, both sturdy and calm. Alara hadn't been on a horse since the one she'd stolen had died in the snow, and the first few minutes were awkward. But the animal was patient, and eventually she found the rhythm. Rowan rode beside her, silent as always. They followed the road east out of town, the only sound the creak of saddles and the soft thud of hooves on packed snow. The landscape was bleak, endless white broken only by skeletal trees and the occasional farmhouse, dark and shuttered against the cold. They didn't talk much. Alara didn't mind. The silence between them felt different now, less like discomfort and more like understanding. Like they'd both seen enough of the world to know that sometimes words didn't help. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses. Rowan built a small fire while Alara checked the map. Ridgewood was still hours away, but they were making good time. You think she'll talk to us? Alara asked, warming her hands over the flames. Don't know, Rowan said. He poked at the fire with a stick. Depends on how bad it was. What do you mean? If Marcus hurt her the way he hurt you, she might not want to remember. He looked at Alara, his pale eyes steady. Talking about it means reliving it. Not everyone can do that. Alara thought about the nightmares. The way Marcus's voice still followed her, even now. I don't know if I can do it either. You're doing it right now. That's different. How? Alara didn't have an answer for that. They rode on. The sun climbed higher, weak and pale, offering no warmth. By late afternoon, they reached Ridgewood, a town even smaller than the one they'd left. Just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. Ada had given them an address, and they found the house easily. It was small and plain, with a garden buried under snow and smoke rising from the chimney. Rowan knocked. They waited. The door opened a crack, and a woman peered out. She was younger than Alara had expected, maybe 30, with brown hair pulled back and tired eyes. Can I help you? We're looking for Claire Dunn, Alara said. The woman's face went still. Who's asking? My name's Alara Voss. This is Rowan Cade. Ada sent us. At the mention of Ada's name, Claire's expression shifted, fear giving way to something like recognition. She opened the door wider. Come in. Quickly. They followed her inside. The house was warm and cluttered, filled with the smell of bread baking. Claire shut the door and locked it, then turned to face them. Ada doesn't send people unless it's serious, she said. What's this about? Marcus Hale, Alara said. The color drained from Claire's face. She took a step back, her hand going to the table as if to steady herself. I don't want to talk about him. I understand, Alara said, but I need your help. I can't. Claire's voice shook. I'm sorry, but I can't. Please, Alara said. She took a step forward, keeping her voice gentle. He's coming after me. He's trying to drag me back. And if I don't stop him, he'll win. Just like he always does. Claire's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. What he did, what he's capable of. I do understand, Alara said. I was married to him for 3 years. Claire stared at her, then she sank into a chair, her hands shaking. He told me I was the only one, that if I left, no one would believe me, that I'd be ruined. He told me the same thing, Alara said quietly. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from Claire. But he was wrong. I left, and I'm still here. Claire looked at her for a long moment. Then she wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. What do you need to know? Alara leaned forward. Everything. Claire talked for over an hour. She told them about the year she'd spent working in Marcus's house, the way he'd been charming at first, almost kind. How slowly, carefully, he'd started to change. The comments that cut just a little too deep. The way he'd isolated her from the other staff, made her dependent on him. And then the night he'd cornered her in the kitchen, his hands on her wrists, his voice low and threatening. She'd left the next morning, packed her things and ran without looking back. But the fear had followed her. She'd moved 3 times in 5 years, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for him to find her. He has a pattern, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. He finds women who are alone. No family, no one to ask questions. He brings them in, makes them think they're safe, and then he owns them. Alara's hands clenched in her lap. Did he ever hurt you, physically? Claire nodded. Once, when I tried to leave the first time. He grabbed my arm, twisted it until I thought it would break. Then he smiled and told me accidents happen. She looked at Alara. He'll do the same to you, or worse. Not if we stop him first, Rowan said. His voice was hard, flat. Will you testify? Tell a court what happened? Claire's face went pale again. I can't. If he finds out, he won't, Alara said. I'll make sure of it. How? I don't know yet, Alara admitted. But I'll figure it out. I have to. Claire looked between them, then she nodded slowly. All right, I'll testify. But you have to promise me something. What? That you'll finish this. That you won't let him walk away. Alara met her gaze. I promise. They rode back to town in the dark, the horses picking their way carefully along the frozen road. Claire had given them a written statement, signed and dated. It wasn't much, but it was something. Proof that Marcus's cruelty hadn't started with Alara. Proof that he had a history. You think it'll be enough? Alara asked. Don't know, Rowan said, but it's a start. Alara was quiet for a moment, then she said, Thank you for coming with me. Rowan glanced at her. You don't have to keep thanking me. I know, but I want to. They rode on. The town came into view just after midnight, the buildings dark except for a few scattered lights. They returned the horses to Fletcher's stable and made their way back to Ada's house. Ada was still awake, sitting at the table with a lantern burning low. She looked up when they came in, her eyes sharp. Well? Alara pulled out Claire's statement and set it on the table. We got it. Ada picked it up, scanning the words. A slow smile spread across her face. This is good. This is very good. Is it enough? Alara asked. Not by itself, Ada admitted, but it's leverage, and leverage is what we need. She looked at Rowan. Any trouble on the road? No, but we need to move fast. Marcus is going to figure out what we're doing. Let him, Ada said. She stood and started pacing. We're not hiding anymore. We're building a case. And when it's strong enough, we take it public. Force the law to listen. Alara sank into a chair, exhaustion pulling at her. And if they don't? Then we make them, Ada said simply. The next morning, everything went to hell. Alara woke to the sound of shouting outside. She stumbled out of bed, her heart racing, and found Rowan already at the window, his rifle in hand. What's happening? She asked. Company, Rowan said. His voice was tight. Marcus brought the sheriff. Alara's stomach dropped. She moved to the window and looked out. Marcus was standing in the street, flanked by his men and a broad-shouldered man in a badge. The sheriff. He was holding a piece of paper, a warrant, maybe. Ada appeared beside her, her face grim. They're coming for you. What do I do? You go out there, Ada said, and you don't let them take you. How am I supposed to? By not running, Ada said. She grabbed Alara's shoulders, her grip firm. You stand your ground. You make them arrest you in front of everyone. And you make damn sure everyone sees it. Alara's breath came short and fast. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything but walk out that door. But she thought of Claire, of the fear in her eyes when she talked about Marcus, of the way she'd agreed to testify anyway. Okay, Alara said. Her voice shook, but she said it. Okay. She pulled on her coat and walked to the door. Rowan moved to follow, but she held up a hand. No, she said. I have to do this alone. Like hell you do. Rowan. She looked at him, and something in her expression made him stop. If you're with me, he'll say I'm being controlled, that I'm not making my own choices. I need to do this by myself. Rowan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Alara opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a wall, but she didn't flinch. She walked down the steps, across the yard, until she was standing in the street facing Marcus and the sheriff. Around them, people were starting to gather again, more than last time. Word had spread. The sheriff stepped forward. He was older, with gray stubble and a weathered face. Ilara Voss? Yes. He held up the paper. I have a warrant for your arrest. Charges of theft and assault. Ilara's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. Those charges are false. That's for a judge to decide, the sheriff said. He didn't sound unkind, just tired. You need to come with me. No. The sheriff frowned. Ma'am, I don't want to make this difficult. Then don't, Ilara said. She raised her voice, making sure everyone could hear. I'm not resisting arrest, but I'm not going quietly either. I want everyone here to know what this man did to me. She pointed at Marcus. He locked me in his house for 3 years. He controlled every part of my life. And when I finally escaped, he came after me with lies and threats because he can't stand the thought of losing control. Marcus's face went cold. That's slander. It's the truth, Ilara shot back, and I can prove it. Prove it how? The sheriff asked. Ilara looked at Ada, who stepped forward holding Claire's statement. With this, testimony from another woman who worked for him, who saw the same pattern, who left because she feared for her life. The sheriff took the paper, his eyes scanning it. His expression shifted, just slightly, but enough that Ilara saw it. Doubt. This doesn't change the warrant, the sheriff said finally. You'll still need to come with me, but I'll make sure the judge sees this. Marcus stepped forward, his voice sharp. Sheriff, that document is hearsay. It has no legal standing. Maybe, the sheriff said, but it's enough to make me ask questions. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time his gaze wasn't friendly. A lot of questions. Marcus's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to argue, but the sheriff cut him off. We'll sort this out at the courthouse, the sheriff said. He turned back to Ilara. Ma'am, I'm asking you again. Will you come peacefully? Ilara looked at the crowd, at Ada, at Rowan standing in the doorway with his rifle still in hand. Then she looked at Marcus, and she saw it, the crack in his armor, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She'd done it. She'd made him doubt himself. Yes, Ilara said. I'll come. The sheriff nodded and gestured for her to follow. As she walked past Marcus, he leaned in close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You just made a mistake, he whispered. Ilara stopped. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time since she'd met him, she wasn't afraid. No, she said. You did. And then she walked away. The jail cell was cold and small, with a single cot and a barred window that let in a thin stream of gray light. Ilara sat on the cot, her arms wrapped around herself, and tried not to think about how much this place felt like the house she'd escaped from. The sheriff had been decent about it. He'd let Ada and Rowan say goodbye before locking the door, and he'd promised to make sure the judge saw Claire's statement, but promises didn't mean much when you were sitting behind bars. Hours passed. The light outside faded. Ilara lay down on the cot, staring at the ceiling, and wondered if she'd just traded one prison for another. Then she heard footsteps. She sat up. The sheriff appeared outside the cell, his expression unreadable. Behind him was a man in a suit, thin, sharp-eyed, with a leather satchel under his arm. Miss Voss, the man said. My name is Henry Collier. I'm a lawyer. Ada hired me to represent you. Ilara blinked. Ada hired you? She's very persuasive, Collier said dryly. He pulled a chair up to the bars and sat down. Now, let's talk about how we're going to win this. Collier spread his papers across the small table the sheriff had brought in, his movements precise and methodical. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been born in a courtroom, sharp suit, sharper eyes, and a way of sitting that suggested he was always one step ahead of everyone else in the room. First things first, he said, not looking up from his notes. The charges against you are serious, but they're also weak. Theft of a horse, assault with intent to harm. Marcus is claiming you attacked him unprovoked and fled with his property. I did take his horse, Ilara said, but it wasn't unprovoked. I know. Collier finally looked at her. Ada gave me the details. And I've read Miss Dunn's statement. What we need to establish is a pattern of abuse and control. If we can prove that your actions were self-defense, that you had reason to fear for your life, then the theft becomes irrelevant. Will the judge believe that? Judge Brennan? Collier tilted his head. He's fair, more fair than most, but he's also old-fashioned. He doesn't like cases that make him uncomfortable, and domestic situations always make judges uncomfortable. So what do we do? Collier leaned back in his chair. We make it impossible for him to ignore. We bring witnesses. We document every instance of abuse you can remember. Dates, times, what was said, what was done. And we pray that Claire Dunn doesn't change her mind about testifying. Alara's stomach tightened. What if she does? Then we lose. Collier said it simply, without sugarcoating. Without her testimony, it's your word against his, and Marcus Hale is a man of means and reputation. You're a woman who fled in the night with stolen property. The optics aren't good. So everything depends on Claire. Everything depends on you both, Collier corrected. She provides the pattern. You provide the specifics. Together, you create reasonable doubt. That's all we need, just enough doubt that the judge can't in good conscience send you back to him. Alara wrapped her arms around herself. The cell felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. How long do I have to stay here? The hearing is set for 3 days from now. Until then, you're a guest of the county. Collier started gathering his papers. I'll be back tomorrow to go over your testimony. In the meantime, try to remember everything you can. Every detail matters. He stood and knocked on the cell door. The sheriff appeared and unlocked it, letting him out. Collier paused at the threshold and looked back at Alara. One more thing, he said. Marcus is going to try to break you before we get to court. He'll send people to talk to you, make offers, threats. Don't engage, don't respond. Let me handle everything. What kind of offers? The kind that sound good until you realize they come with chains. Collier's expression was grim. He wants you to believe you can't win. That's his whole strategy. Don't let him. Then he was gone, and Alara was alone again. The first night in the cell was the worst. Alara lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The cold, the quiet, the knowledge that Marcus was out there somewhere, probably in a warm hotel room, planning his next move while she shivered behind bars. She thought about Claire, about the fear in her eyes when she'd talked about him, about how she'd agreed to testify anyway, even though it meant dragging herself back into the nightmare she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. That took courage. More courage than Alara felt like she had. But then she thought about Rowan, about the way he'd stood beside her on Ada's porch when Marcus had come calling, about how he hadn't asked for anything in return, hadn't expected gratitude or payment. He'd just shown up because it was the right thing to do. Maybe that was what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She must have fallen asleep eventually because she woke to the sound of the cell door rattling. Pale morning light filtered through the barred window. The sheriff stood outside holding a tray with bread and coffee. Breakfast, he said, sliding it through the gap at the bottom of the door. Alara sat up, her whole body aching from the thin mattress. Thank you. The sheriff nodded. He started to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I don't like this case. Alara looked at him. Then why are you helping him? Because that's my job. I enforce the law, not my opinions. He rubbed the back of his neck. But I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen enough to know when something doesn't add up. Your story, it adds up. His doesn't. Will you say that in court? I'll tell the judge what I observed, what I heard. Beyond that, it's out of my hands. He met her gaze. But I hope you win. Then he left, and Alara was alone with her coffee and the strange, fragile feeling that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fighting this battle by herself. Collier came back that afternoon, armed with more papers and a list of questions that made Alara's head spin. He wanted to know everything, every instance of Marcus raising his voice, every time he'd controlled where she went or who she talked to, every moment she'd felt unsafe. At first it was hard to remember. The memories had been locked away so tightly that dragging them out felt like pulling splinters from under her skin. But Collier was patient. He asked the same question 5 different ways until something clicked, and then he'd write furiously while Alara talked. By the end of the session, she'd filled 3 pages with incidents she'd half forgotten, things she'd convinced herself weren't that bad at the time. This is good, Collier said, reviewing his notes. This is very good. It shows escalation, control leading to isolation, leading to physical violence. It doesn't feel like enough, Elara said quietly. It never does, Collier replied. But trust me, it's enough to make the judge think twice. He looked at her. How are you holding up? I'm tired. That's normal. This process is designed to be exhausting. Marcus knows that. He's counting on you giving up before we get to trial. I'm not going to give up. Good. Collier stood and gathered his papers. Because tomorrow gets harder. What happens tomorrow? Marcus's lawyer will want to interview you. I can be present, but he has the right to ask questions. It won't be pleasant. Elara's stomach twisted. What kind of questions? The kind designed to make you look unstable, emotional, irrational. Collier's voice was matter-of-fact. He'll try to get you to lose your temper, to say something he can use against you. Don't take the bait. Answer honestly but calmly, and if you need a break, you tell me. What if I can't stay calm? Then we take a break, Collier said simply. This isn't a test of your strength. It's a test of your resolve. And from what I've seen, you've got plenty of that. Marcus's lawyer arrived the next morning. His name was Preston, and he looked exactly like the kind of man Marcus would hire. Expensive suit, cold smile, eyes that cataloged every weakness like he was compiling a list. He sat across from Elara in the small room the sheriff had provided, with Collier on one side and a bailiff standing by the door. Preston opened a leather folder and pulled out a pen. Miss Voss, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I didn't agree, Elara said. I was told I had to. Preston's smile didn't waver. Nevertheless, I appreciate your cooperation. Now, I'd like to go over the events of the night you left Mr. Hale's residence. You claim he was violent toward you. Is that correct? It's not a claim, it's a fact. I see. Preston made a note. And prior to this alleged violence, had Mr. Hale ever struck you? Elara hesitated. The truth was complicated. Marcus had been careful. He'd shoved her a few times, grabbed her hard enough to leave bruises, but he'd never hit her. Not with a closed fist, anyway. He pushed me, she said, more than once, hard enough that I fell. But he never struck you. Pushing is striking. Is it? Preston's tone was mild, conversational. Because in my experience, Miss Voss, there's a difference between a disagreement that gets physical and actual assault. Wouldn't you agree? No, Elara said flatly. I wouldn't. Collier leaned forward. Mr. Preston, if you're trying to suggest that my client is exaggerating, I'm not suggesting anything, Preston interrupted smoothly. I'm simply trying to establish the facts. Miss Voss has made very serious allegations against my client. I have a responsibility to examine those allegations. Then examine them, Collier said. But do it respectfully. Preston turned back to Elara. Let's talk about the night you left. You say Mr. Hale threatened you. What exactly did he say? Elara's hands clenched under the table. She could still hear Marcus's voice, low and venomous, the way it had been right before she'd shoved him. He said if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure I regretted it, that no one would believe me, that I'd end up with nothing. And you interpreted that as a physical threat? How else was I supposed to interpret it? Perhaps as the emotional response of a man whose wife was abandoning him? Preston suggested. People say things they don't mean when they're upset, Miss Voss. Surely you understand that. He meant it, Elara said. Her voice shook, but she kept going. Every word. And he proved it by coming after me. Preston made another note. Let's talk about the horse. You admit you took it without permission. Yes. And you had no intention of returning it. No. So you stole it. Elara's jaw tightened. I took what I needed to survive. That's not how the law works, Miss Voss. Preston leaned back in his chair. Regardless of your feelings toward Mr. Hale, theft is theft. You can't simply take what doesn't belong to you. He didn't own that horse any more than he owned me, Elara shot back. And I'd do it again. Preston's smile widened. I appreciate your honesty. He closed his folder. One last question. You've claimed that Mr. Hale isolated you, controlled you, yet you managed to plan an escape, execute it, and evade capture for over a week. That doesn't sound like someone who was helpless. Elara stared at him. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him understand that being smart enough to escape didn't mean she hadn't been trapped. But Collier's hand settled on her arm, a gentle warning. I wasn't helpless, Alara said quietly. I was surviving. There's a difference. Preston stood. Thank you for your time, Miss Voss. I'm sure we'll speak again in court. He left, and the room felt bigger without him. Alara sagged in her chair, exhausted. Collier let out a long breath. You did well, he said. I wanted to hit him. I know, but you didn't. That's what matters. Collier gathered his papers. He's going to use that last bit, the fact that you planned your escape. He'll argue it shows you weren't in immediate danger. That's insane. It's strategy, Collier corrected, and it's effective. But we'll counter it. We'll show that careful planning doesn't negate fear, it proves it. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, and thought about Preston's questions. About the way he'd twisted everything she'd said, made it sound like she was the problem. She wondered if the judge would see through it. She wondered if Claire would still be willing to testify after hearing what Preston would ask her. She wondered if any of this was worth it. Around midnight, she heard footsteps. Not the sheriff's steady gait, but something quieter. Someone trying not to be heard. Alara sat up, her heart pounding. A figure appeared outside the cell. For a moment, she thought it was Marcus, and her hand went instinctively to the knife that wasn't there anymore. Then the figure stepped into the faint light from the window, and she recognized him. Rowan. What are you doing here? Alara whispered. Visiting hours, Rowan said dryly. He pulled a small stool over and sat down outside the bars. Sheriff's asleep. Figured you could use some company. You're going to get in trouble. Probably. He didn't seem concerned. You holding up? I don't know, Alara admitted. Preston, Marcus's lawyer, he made me feel like everything I said was a lie, like I'm making this all up. That's his job. I know, but it's still... She stopped, her throat tight. What if the judge believes him? Then we deal with it, Rowan said. His voice was steady, certain. But stop thinking about what ifs. You'll drive yourself crazy. Alara leaned against the wall. I keep wondering if I should have just kept running. Maybe I'd be safer. You'd be alone, Rowan said, and you'd spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. That's not living. Neither is this. No, Rowan agreed, but this ends. One way or another, in 3 days, you'll know where you stand. That's more than you had a month ago. Alara looked at him through the bars. Why are you doing this, really? Rowan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I told you I ran once. I didn't tell you why. You don't have to. I had a family, Rowan said. A wife, a son. I wasn't good to them. I drank too much, worked too little, and when things got hard, I left. Told myself they were better off without me. He looked down at his hands. I spent 10 years alone in that cabin convincing myself I'd done the right thing. Then I met you, and I realized I'd just been a coward. Alara's chest tightened. You're not a coward. I was, Rowan said, but you're fighting. Even when you're scared, even when it seems impossible, you're still fighting. And I guess I wanted to see what that looked like. Maybe learn something. Alara didn't know what to say, so she just sat there, on her side of the bars, and let the silence stretch between them. I got a letter, Rowan said after a while. 3 days ago, from my wife. Alara looked up. What did it say? That my son's sick, real sick. She doesn't know if he'll make it. Rowan's voice was rough. She asked if I wanted to see him before... He stopped. Are you going to go? I don't know. Rowan rubbed his face. I left them. I don't have the right to show up now. Maybe not, Alara said. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't. Rowan looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. I'm scared. Of what? That he won't want to see me. That I waited too long. He let out a shaky breath. That I'll get there and realize I've wasted the last 10 years being angry at myself instead of just trying. Alara reached through the bars, her hand found his, and she squeezed. Then stop wasting time. Rowan held her hand for a moment. Then he stood, nodded once, and disappeared back into the shadows. Alara lay back down, but this time sleep came easier. The morning of the hearing, Alara woke early. The sheriff brought her a clean dress. Ada had sent it, along with a note that just said, "Be strong." Alara put it on, her hands shaking as she buttoned it. The fabric was dark blue, simple but respectable, the kind of dress a woman wore when she needed to be taken seriously. Collier arrived an hour before they were due at the courthouse. He looked her over and nodded approvingly. "Good. You look composed." "I don't feel composed." "No one does," Collier said. "But the judge won't know that unless you show him." He set his briefcase on the table. "Claire's here. She arrived last night. She's nervous, but she's ready." "What about Marcus?" "He'll be there. With Preston and half a dozen character witnesses, no doubt." Collier's expression was grim. "But we've got something he doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth." The courthouse was bigger than Alara had expected, a 2-story brick building with tall windows and a bell tower. The sheriff led her inside through a side entrance, and they made their way to a small room where Collier was waiting. Ada was there too, and Rowan and Claire, who looked pale but determined. "They're ready for us," Collier said. He looked at Alara. "Remember, stay calm, answer honestly, and don't let Preston rattle you. I'll object if he crosses a line." Alara nodded. Her mouth was dry, and her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. But she followed Collier through the doors into the courtroom. It was smaller than she'd imagined from the outside. Rows of wooden benches, a raised platform where the judge would sit, and a table on each side for the lawyers. Marcus was already there, sitting beside Preston, his expression unreadable. When he saw Alara, he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Alara forced herself to look away. She took her seat beside Collier and folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and Judge Brennan entered. He was older, with white hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by much. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the papers in front of him. "This is a hearing to determine whether the charges against Miss Alara Voss have merit," he said. His voice was deep and gravelly. "Mr. Preston, you may present your case." Preston stood, his movement smooth and practiced. "Thank you, Your Honor. The facts of this case are simple. On the night of February 10th, Miss Voss assaulted my client, Marcus Hale, in his own home. She then stole his horse and fled the property. Mr. Hale, concerned for her safety and well-being, attempted to locate her. When he finally did, she refused to return. We are asking the court to remand Miss Voss into Mr. Hale's custody and to pursue charges for theft and assault." Judge Brennan looked at Collier. "And your response?" Collier stood. "Your Honor, this case is not about theft or assault. It's about survival. Miss Voss was trapped in an abusive relationship for 3 years. She fled because she feared for her life. Everything she did, taking the horse, leaving in the night, was an act of self-preservation. We have testimony from another woman who experienced similar treatment from Mr. Hale. We have documentation of Miss Voss's injuries, and we have Miss Voss herself, who is willing to tell the court exactly what happened." Judge Brennan leaned back in his chair. "Very well, Mr. Preston, call your first witness." Preston called Marcus. Marcus took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted himself. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and utterly convincing as he described Alara as a troubled woman who'd become increasingly unstable over the past year. He painted a picture of himself as the patient husband, trying desperately to help her, only to be attacked and abandoned. It was a masterful performance, and Alara hated every second of it. When Collier's turn came to cross-examine, he stood and approached the witness stand slowly. "Mr. Hale," he said, "you've described Miss Voss as unstable. Can you give me specific examples?" Marcus shrugged. "She was forgetful, emotional. She'd have outbursts over small things." "Such as?" "I don't know. Dishes left out, plans changing, normal things." "And how did you respond to these outbursts?" "I tried to calm her down, reassure her." "Did you ever raise your voice?" "Maybe once or twice." "Everyone loses their temper occasionally." "Did you ever push her?" Marcus hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Alara saw it. So did Collier. "I may have steadied her, once or twice. She was upset, and I didn't want her to hurt herself." Steadied her," Collier repeated. "Is that what you call it when you grab someone hard enough to leave bruises?" "I never—" Did you or did you not put your hands on Miss Voss in a manner that caused her physical harm? Marcus's jaw tightened. I was trying to help her. That's not an answer, Mr. Hale. Judge Brennan leaned forward. Answer the question, Mr. Hale. Marcus looked at the judge, then back at Collier. Yes, I may have grabbed her, but only because I was worried about her. And on the night she left, what were you worried about? That she was going to do something rash. She'd been talking about leaving for weeks. I told her it wasn't safe. Or, Collier said quietly, you told her that if she left, you'd make sure she regretted it. Preston shot to his feet. Objection, leading the witness. Sustained, Judge Brennan said, but he was looking at Marcus with a new expression. Doubt. Collier stepped back. No further questions. Marcus left the stand, his face tight. Alara watched him return to his seat, and for the first time she thought maybe, just maybe, the cracks were starting to show. Then it was Alara's turn. She took the stand, her legs unsteady, and placed her hand on the Bible the bailiff offered. She swore to tell the truth, and then she sat down and looked out at the courtroom, at Marcus, at the judge, at Rowan and Ada in the back row. Collier approached gently. Miss Voss, can you tell the court how you met Marcus Hale? Alara took a breath. I was working at a boarding house. He was staying there. He was charming, kind. He made me feel like I mattered. And when did that change? After we married. It was small things at first. He didn't like me talking to other people. He wanted to know where I was all the time. Then he started deciding what I wore, what I ate, who I could see. Her voice shook, but she kept going. By the end, I couldn't leave the house without his permission. Did he ever hurt you physically? Yes. Can you describe one instance? Alara closed her eyes. There was a night, about 6 months before I left, when I burned dinner. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it until I thought it would break. Then he made me stand there and watch while he threw the food away. He said I needed to learn. The courtroom was silent. And the night you left? He told me if I ever tried to run, he'd find me and make sure I never tried again. I believed him. So I waited until he was asleep. And I left. Alara looked at Marcus. And I'd do it again. Preston's cross-examination was brutal. He asked about the horse, about the money she'd taken from Marcus's desk, about why she hadn't gone to the sheriff if she was really in danger. Alara answered as best she could, but by the end she felt hollowed out, like every part of her had been put on display and picked apart. Then Claire took the stand. She was shaking so badly the bailiff had to help her sit down. But when Collier asked her to describe her time working for Marcus, her voice was steady. She told the court everything, the isolation, the control, the night he'd hurt her. And when Preston tried to discredit her, tried to suggest she was lying for attention, she looked him in the eye and said, I have no reason to lie. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I did. By the time she was finished, there were tears on her face. But she'd done it. Judge Brennan called for a recess. Alara sat in the small room with Collier and Ada, unable to speak. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. You did good, Ada said. Both of you. Will it be enough? Alara asked. Collier didn't answer. And that was answer enough. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Brennan looked tired. He cleared his throat and looked at the papers in front of him. I've heard testimony from both sides, he said, and I'll be honest, this is not an easy case. There are serious allegations, and there's evidence to support both narratives. He paused. However, I'm troubled by certain inconsistencies in Mr. Hale's testimony, and I'm moved by the courage it took for both Miss Voss and Miss Dunn to come forward. Alara's heart stopped. Therefore, Judge Brennan continued, I'm dismissing the charges against Miss Voss. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order against Mr. Hale. He is not to contact, approach, or communicate with Miss Voss in any way. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. The courtroom erupted. Preston was on his feet objecting, but the judge waved him off. Marcus's face had gone white. His eyes locked on Alara with something close to hatred. But Alara didn't care. She was free. Collier was shaking her hand, Ada was hugging her, and Rowan was standing in the back, smiling for the first time since she'd met him. She'd won. The walk out of the courthouse felt surreal. Alara's legs moved, but she couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet. The cold air hit her face when they pushed through the doors, and suddenly everything was too bright, too loud, too real. People were congratulating her, strangers whose faces blurred together, and Ada was talking about going to Fletcher's for a celebratory meal, but Ilara couldn't process any of it. She'd won. The judge had believed her. Marcus couldn't touch her anymore. But she didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow. "You need to sit down," Rowan said. He'd appeared at her elbow, his hand steady on her arm, guiding her away from the crowd toward a bench at the edge of the courthouse steps. Ilara sat. Her hands were shaking again, worse than before. "I thought I'd feel different." "Different how?" "I don't know." Happy, relieved. She looked at her hands. "I just feel tired." "That's normal," Rowan said. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You've been running on fear and adrenaline for weeks. Now that it's over, your body's catching up." "Is it over?" Ilara asked quietly. "The judge said Marcus can't contact me, but that doesn't mean he won't try." "He tries. He goes to jail," Rowan said. "And men like him don't like jail. He'll move on. Find someone else to control." The thought made Ilara's stomach turn. Someone else will go through what I did. Maybe. Or maybe Claire's testimony will follow him. Maybe enough people will know what he is that he won't be able to hide it anymore. Rowan looked at her. "You can't save everyone, Ilara. You can barely save yourself." "I know." She let out a shaky breath. I wish I could make sure he never hurts anyone again." "You did what you could," Rowan said. "That's all anyone can ask." Ada appeared, her face flushed from the cold and excitement. "There you are. Come on. Fletcher's expecting us. Half the town's going to be there. They all want to hear what happened." Ilara's chest tightened. "I don't know if I can—" "You can," Ada said firmly. "You just stood up in court and told your story to a judge. You can handle a few nosy neighbors." She softened slightly. "Besides, you need to eat. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Ilara couldn't remember. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's go." Fletcher's general store had been transformed. Someone had pushed the counter aside to make room for tables, and there were platters of food, roasted chicken, bread, vegetables, even a pie. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and smelled like home. People crowded around talking and laughing, and when Ilara walked in, they erupted into applause. She froze in the doorway. All these people, most of whom she'd never spoken to, were clapping for her, for surviving, for fighting back. It felt overwhelming and humbling and wrong all at once. "Speech!" someone called. "No," Ilara said quickly, but Ada pushed her forward, and suddenly she was standing in the middle of the room with everyone watching. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say." "Say thank you," Ada prompted. "Thank you," Ilara said. Her voice came out small. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Thank you, all of you, for believing me, for standing with me. I couldn't have done this alone." "You're not alone," Fletcher said from behind the counter. "That's the whole point." People murmured agreement. Someone handed Ilara a plate piled high with food, and she took it even though her stomach was in knots. She found a corner where the crowd was thinner and sat down, picking at the chicken without really tasting it. Claire appeared beside her, holding her own plate. "May I?" "Of course." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Claire said, "I almost didn't come today. I woke up this morning and thought about leaving, just packing my things and disappearing before I had to testify." "What stopped you?" "You," Claire said simply. "I kept thinking about what you said, that you'd rather die than go back to him. And I realized I'd been living like I was already dead. Too scared to move, too scared to speak. I didn't want to do that anymore." Ilara looked at her. "Are you going to stay? In Ridgewood?" "I don't know yet," Claire admitted. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll go somewhere new. Start fresh." She smiled, small but genuine. "For the first time in 5 years, I actually get to decide." Ilara understood that feeling. The weight of choice, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. They ate together, and slowly the knot in Ilara's stomach began to loosen. She even managed to smile when Fletcher came over with 2 slices of pie and insisted they try it. Best pie in 3 counties, he said proudly. It was too sweet, and the crust was a little burnt, but Alara ate every bite. The party lasted into the evening. People drifted in and out, some staying for hours, others just stopping by to offer congratulations. Alara talked to more people than she could count, their names blurring together, but their kindness felt real. It wasn't pity anymore. It was respect. When the crowd finally thinned, Alara found herself standing outside with Rowan, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of beautiful that made your chest ache. "When are you leaving?" Alara asked. Rowan didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Tomorrow morning, early, to see your son." "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I still don't know what I'm going to say to him." "You'll figure it out," Alara said. "You always do." "I'm not sure about that." Rowan looked at her. "What about you? What are you going to do now?" Alara hadn't thought that far ahead. For weeks, all she'd focused on was surviving, winning, getting free. She hadn't considered what came after. "I don't know," she admitted. "Stay here, I guess. At least for a while. Ada said I could help her, work with other women who need to get out. I think I'd like that." "You'd be good at it," Rowan said. "Maybe." Alara wrapped her arms around herself. "I keep waiting for it to sink in, that I'm actually free, that I can go anywhere, do anything, but it doesn't feel real yet." "It will," Rowan said. "Give it time." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. Finally, Alara said, "Thank you for everything. I know I keep saying it, but—" "You don't have to," Rowan interrupted. "I didn't do it for thanks." "Then why did you do it?" Rowan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because you reminded me that it's not too late. To be better. To try." He looked at her. "I spent 10 years convincing myself I didn't deserve a second chance. You made me realize that's not for me to decide. It's for the people I hurt. And the only way to find out is to show up and ask." Alara's throat tightened. "Your son's lucky to have a father willing to come back." "I don't know if he'll see it that way," Rowan said, "but I have to try." "You do," Alara agreed, and then, because she didn't know what else to say, she stepped forward and hugged him. Rowan went still for a moment, like he'd forgotten how this worked. Then his arms came up, careful and tentative, and he hugged her back. "Good luck," Alara whispered. "You too." Rowan left before dawn. Alara didn't see him go. She was asleep in the small room above Fletcher's store that Ada had arranged for her. But when she woke and went downstairs, Fletcher told her he'd stopped by to say goodbye. "Left you this," Fletcher said, handing her a folded piece of paper. Alara opened it. Inside was a rough map, similar to the one he'd given her weeks ago, but this one showed the route from town to his cabin. At the bottom, he'd written, "If you ever need a place to go, the door's open." Alara folded the map carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She didn't know if she'd ever use it, but knowing it was there felt like a lifeline. The days that followed were strange. Without the constant pressure of fear, Alara didn't know what to do with herself. Ada put her to work organizing files and writing letters, and that helped. So did the women who started coming to the house. Women like her and Claire, with haunted eyes and stories they were afraid to tell. Alara listened to them, told them they weren't crazy, they weren't weak, they weren't alone. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. But she kept showing up. A week after the trial, Alara was sorting through Ada's files when there was a knock at the door. Ada answered it, and Alara heard a man's voice, unfamiliar, hesitant. "I'm looking for Alara Voss." Alara's heart stopped. She stood and moved to the doorway, ready to run if it was one of Marcus's men. But the man at the door was young, maybe 20, with a thin face and nervous hands. "I'm Alara," she said cautiously. The man looked relieved. "My name's Thomas. I'm a reporter for the territorial newspaper. I heard about your case, what happened in court. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to me. Tell your story." Alara's first instinct was to say no. She'd spent 3 years hiding, and even now the idea of putting herself out there felt dangerous. But then she thought about Claire, about the other women Marcus had hurt, about the ones he might hurt in the future. "What would you do with it?" she asked. "The story." "Publish it," Thomas said. "Let people know what happened, what he did. Maybe it'll help someone else." Ada appeared beside Alara, her expression thoughtful. It could work. If enough people know what Marcus Hale is, it'll be harder for him to hide. Alara looked at the young reporter. Will you print it exactly as I say it? No changes, no making it sound prettier than it was. I promise, Thomas said. Alara took a breath. Okay, come in. They spent the next 3 hours at Ada's kitchen table, Alara talking while Thomas scribbled notes. She told him everything, the isolation, the control, the fear. The night she'd finally left, the trial. She didn't hold back, didn't soften the edges. If this was going to mean something, it had to be the truth. When she was finished, Thomas looked up from his notes. This is powerful. People need to hear this. When will it run? Ada asked. Next week's edition. Maybe sooner if my editor agrees. Thomas stood and shook Ilara's hand. Thank you for trusting me with this. After he left, Ilara sat at the table, staring at her hands. Did I just make a mistake? No, Ada said firmly. You just made sure Marcus Hale can't hide anymore. That's not a mistake. That's justice. The article ran 5 days later. Thomas had titled it, A Woman's Fight for Freedom, The True Story of Alara Voss. Alara read it 3 times, her hands shaking. He'd kept his promise. Every word was hers, raw and honest and real. The reaction was immediate. People Alara had never met stopped her on the street to tell her they'd read it, that they believed her, that she was brave. Some women pulled her aside and whispered their own stories, tears in their eyes, thanking her for making them feel less alone. But there were others, too. People who said she was lying, that she'd destroyed a good man's reputation for attention. Anonymous letters arrived at Ada's house, some supportive, some vicious. Ada burned the vicious ones without letting Alara read them. Ignore them, Ada said. People are uncomfortable with the truth, especially when it forces them to look at their own choices. A week after the article published, Ilara received a letter. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. Neat, precise, controlled. Marcus. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single sentence. You've made a powerful enemy. Alara stared at it for a long moment. Then she walked to the stove, held the letter over the flame, and watched it burn. Let him be angry, she said to the empty room. I'm not afraid of him anymore. And for the first time, she meant it. Winter began to ease. The snow melted slowly, revealing mud and dead grass and the first tentative hints of green. Spring was coming, and with it, the promise of something new. Alara had settled into a routine. She worked with Ada during the day, helping women escape bad situations. At night, she stayed in the small room above Fletcher's store, reading books he loaned her and writing letters to Claire, who decided to stay in Ridgewood and open a bakery. Life wasn't perfect. Alara still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched when someone moved too quickly. But the fear was smaller now, manageable. And there were good days too, days when she laughed, when she felt the sun on her face and thought maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. Then, 2 months after the trial, a telegram arrived. It was from Rowan. Alara opened it with trembling hands, afraid of what it might say. But the message was short and simple. Coming back. Bringing someone. We'll explain. 3 days later, a wagon pulled up outside Fletcher's store. Alara was sweeping the porch when she heard it, and she looked up to see Rowan climbing down from the driver's seat. He looked different, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. And behind him, carefully descending from the wagon, was a boy. He was maybe 12, thin and pale, with Rowan's eyes and a cautious, guarded expression. He leaned heavily on a crutch, and Alara could see the way his left leg didn't quite work right. Rowan saw her and smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Alara, he said, this is my son, Daniel. Daniel looked at her, then back at his father. Is this the woman you told me about? Yeah, Rowan said. This is her. Alara didn't know what to say. She looked at Rowan, questions in her eyes, and he nodded. Can we talk? He asked. They sat on the porch while Daniel explored the store with Fletcher. Rowan told her everything, how he'd traveled 3 days to reach the town where his wife and son lived, how he'd stood outside their house for an hour, terrified to knock, how his wife had opened the door and just stared at him, and for a moment he'd thought she'd slam it in his face. But she hadn't. She'd let him in, let him see Daniel. The boy was sick, something with his lungs, the doctor said, made worse by the cold. He needed warmer air, cleaner air, and a place where he could rest and heal. She asked if I wanted to take him, Rowan said. Not forever, just for a while, until he's stronger. He looked at Alara. I said yes. And Daniel? He was scared at first, didn't know me, but we talked. A lot. On the way here. Rowan's voice was rough. He's a good kid. Better than I deserve. That's not true, Alara said. Maybe not, Rowan said, but I'm going to spend every day trying to prove it. Alara looked through the window at Daniel, who was examining a display of tools with the kind of intense focus only children had. What are you going to do? Take him back to the cabin. It's quiet there, clean air. He'll have space to heal. Rowan paused. And I was thinking, if you wanted, there's room. Not just for visits, for good. Alara's breath caught. What? You said you didn't know what to do next, Rowan said, and I could use the help. Daniel's going to need someone who knows how to take care of people. Someone patient. He looked at her. Someone like you. Rowan, I can't. You can, he said. If you want to, no pressure, no expectations. Just an option. Alara stared at him. A month ago, she would have said no immediately. The idea of leaving town, of going back into the mountains, of living in close quarters with anyone, it would have been too much. But now, looking at Rowan and thinking about that quiet cabin and the life she could build there, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a choice. Can I think about it? She asked. Take all the time you need, Rowan said. Alara spent 3 days thinking. She talked to Ada, who told her to follow her instincts. She talked to Claire, who wrote back saying that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let yourself be happy. She even talked to Fletcher, who just shrugged and said, You've been through hell. Maybe it's time for something quiet. On the third night, Alara sat in her room and thought about what she really wanted. Not what she was afraid of, not what she thought she should do, but what she actually wanted. And the answer was simpler than she'd expected. She wanted to stop running. She wanted to build something, and she wanted to do it with people who understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. The next morning, she found Rowan at Ada's house. He was loading supplies into the wagon, preparing for the trip back to the cabin. I'm coming with you, Alara said. Rowan looked up. You sure? No, Alara said honestly. But I think that's okay. Rowan smiled. Yeah, I think it is. They left 2 days later. Ada threw a small going-away party. Nothing fancy, just food and friends and a few tears. Claire sent a letter promising to visit in the summer. Fletcher gave Alara a bag of supplies and told her to take care of herself. You've got people now, he said. Don't forget that. I won't, Alara promised. The ride to the cabin took 2 days. Daniel talked the whole time about his mother, about the town he'd grown up in, about the books he'd read and the things he wanted to do when he got better. He asked Alara questions too, and she answered them as best she could, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of gold and pink. Alara climbed down from the wagon and looked at the place that had saved her life months ago. It looked the same, small, rough, isolated, but this time it didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a beginning. What do you think? Rowan asked. I think it's perfect, Alara said. God. The first few weeks were an adjustment. Alara had to relearn how to share space with people, how to let herself be part of something without waiting for it to turn bad. Daniel was easy, curious and kind, with a sharp sense of humor that surprised her. He asked about her past once, and when she gave him the short version, he just nodded and said, That sounds hard. Not I'm sorry, or you're so brave. Just an acknowledgement. It was exactly what she'd needed. Rowan was harder, not because he was difficult, but because Alara kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to become controlling, demanding, cruel. But he never did. He gave her space when she needed it, helped when she asked, and never pushed. One night, about a month after they'd arrived, Alara found Rowan sitting outside staring at the stars. Can't sleep? She asked. Something like that, Rowan said. He gestured to the space beside him. Join me. Alara sat, The air was cold but not unbearable, and the sky was so clear she could see the Milky Way stretching overhead. "I keep thinking about what you said," Rowan said after a while, "about how you didn't feel free yet, that it didn't feel real." "Yeah. Does it now?" Alara thought about it. "Sometimes, when I'm working in the garden or cooking dinner or listening to Daniel talk about his books, yeah, in those moments it feels real." She paused. "But sometimes I still wake up and think I'm back in that house, that none of this happened." "That'll fade," Rowan said. "Eventually." "How do you know?" "Because I used to dream I was still with my family, that I'd never left. And it was worse than the nightmares, because waking up meant realizing I'd made a choice I couldn't undo." He looked at her. "But then I got Daniel back, and those dreams stopped. Not all at once, but slowly. Because I had something real to hold on to." "Is that what this is?" Alara asked. "Something real?" "I think so," Rowan said. "Or at least it's the start of something real." Alara looked up at the stars. She thought about Marcus, about the years she'd lost, about the fear that still lived in her chest. But she also thought about Claire's testimony, about the article, about the women who'd reached out to say thank you. She thought about Daniel's laugh and Ada's sharp kindness and Rowan's quiet, steady presence. "I'm glad I came here," Alara said quietly. "Me too," Rowan said. Spring arrived in full force. The snow melted completely, revealing wildflowers and green grass and a world that felt alive again. Alara planted a garden, something she'd never been allowed to do at Marcus's house. Tomatoes, beans, herbs, simple things, but they were hers. Daniel got stronger. The clean air and rest worked wonders, and by early summer he was walking without the crutch most days. He helped Alara in the garden, and Rowan taught him how to fish and set traps. It was a quiet life, but it was theirs. One afternoon in late May, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Alara's heart jumped into her throat, old instincts kicking in, but Rowan put a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said. "I know him." The rider was a young man, maybe 20, with a familiar face. It took Alara a moment to place him. Thomas, the reporter. He dismounted and approached carefully. "Miss Voss, Mr. Cade, I hope I'm not intruding." "What are you doing here?" Alara asked. Thomas pulled a folded newspaper from his saddlebag. "I thought you'd want to see this." Alara took it. The headline read, "Marcus Hale arrested on charges of fraud and assault." Her breath caught. "After your story ran, other women came forward," Thomas explained. 3 of them, with testimony and evidence. The law couldn't ignore it anymore. He was arrested last week. Alara stared at the article, her hands shaking. "Is he going to trial?" "Yes, and with the evidence they have, he'll likely be convicted." Thomas smiled. "You did this. Your story gave them the courage to speak up." Alara didn't know what to say. She'd hoped, dreamed even, that Marcus would face consequences, but she'd never really believed it would happen. "Thank you," she managed, "for letting me know." Thomas nodded. He stayed for dinner, telling them about the case and the changes happening in the territory. New laws protecting women, more resources for those trying to leave abusive situations. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. After he left, Alara sat on the porch with the newspaper in her lap. Rowan joined her, Daniel between them. "You okay?" Rowan asked. "I think so," Alara said. She looked at the headline again. "I thought I'd feel happier, but mostly I just feel relieved." That's normal," Rowan said. "Justice doesn't erase what happened. It just means it's over." "Is it?" Daniel asked. "Over, I mean?" Alara looked at the boy, this child who'd been abandoned by his father and was still learning to trust again, who understood in his own way what it meant to rebuild. "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." Again, summer stretched long and warm. Alara's garden flourished. Daniel grew taller, stronger, his laugh echoing through the clearing more days than not. Rowan built an addition onto the cabin, a small room with a window that faced the mountains, a space that was just for Alara. "You need somewhere that's yours," he said when he showed it to her. "Somewhere you can go when the world gets too loud." Alara stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Rowan said. "You've given us more than we've given you." But Alara wasn't sure that was true. Because what she'd found here wasn't just safety or shelter, it was family. Imperfect, messy, cobbled together from broken pieces, but family nonetheless. One night in August, Ada arrived with Claire. They'd made the trip together, bringing news and supplies and enough laughter to fill the cabin for days. They stayed a week, and for the first time, Alara saw what her life could look like. Not isolated, not alone, but connected. Part of something bigger. On their last night, they sat around the fire outside, passing a bottle of whiskey and telling stories. Daniel had fallen asleep against Rowan's shoulder, and the stars overhead were so bright they felt close enough to touch. "I'm proud of you," Ada said, looking at Alara. "You know that, right?" "I didn't do anything special," Alara said. "Yes, you did," Claire said quietly. "You survived, and then you helped the rest of us survive too." Alara's throat tightened. She looked at the faces around the fire. Ada, Claire, Rowan, Daniel. People who'd seen her at her worst and stayed anyway. People who'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. "I couldn't have done it alone," Alara said. "No one can," Ada said. "That's the whole point." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. She felt home. Autumn came with a riot of color, gold and red and orange painting the mountains in shades of fire. Alara stood at the edge of the clearing one morning, watching the sunrise, and thought about how far she'd come. From the woman who'd collapsed in the snow, ready to give up, to this, a life she'd built with her own hands. It wasn't perfect. She still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden movements, still carried the weight of everything that had happened. But she'd learned that healing wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about deciding they didn't get to define her anymore. Rowan joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He passed one to her without a word, and they stood together, watching the light spread across the valley. "Daniel's talking about going back to school," Rowan said after a while. "There's a teacher in town who's willing to take him on." "That's good," Alara said. "He's smart. He should have the chance." "Oh, he asked if you'd come with him for the first day. Said he'd be less nervous if you were there." Alara smiled. "Of course I will." They were quiet for a moment. Then Rowan said, "I got a letter from my wife. She wants to visit. See how Daniel's doing." "Are you okay with that?" "Yeah," Rowan said. "I think I am. She's not my enemy. Never was. I was just too scared to see it." He looked at Alara. "Funny how that works. You spend so long running from the things that scare you, you forget there's another option." "What's that?" Turning around and facing them. Alara thought about Marcus, about the trial, and the article, and everything that had come after, about the choice she'd made to stop running and start fighting. "It's not easy," she said. "No," Rowan agreed, "but it's worth it." They finished their coffee in silence. Then Daniel appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking what was for breakfast. And just like that, the day began. Ordinary, unremarkable, beautiful. This was her life now. Not the one she'd planned, not the one she'd dreamed of as a girl, but hers. Built from ruins and second chances and the stubborn, reckless belief that she deserved better. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Well, by the time winter returned, the cabin had been transformed. What had once been a solitary outpost had become a home. There were curtains in the windows, books on the shelves, and the kind of clutter that only came from people actually living somewhere. Daniel's drawings covered one wall. Alara's herbs hung drying from the rafters. Rowan's tools were organized in the shed he'd built behind the house. They celebrated Daniel's 13th birthday with a cake Claire had sent and presents they'd made themselves. He cried when he opened Rowan's gift, a hand-carved fishing rod, and Alara pretended not to notice. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Alara and Rowan sat by the fire. The snow was falling outside, soft and steady, covering the world in white. "Do you ever regret it?" Rowan asked. "Coming here." "No," Alara said without hesitation. "Do you? Bringing me?" "Not for a second." Alara looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. I used to think freedom meant being alone, that if I didn't need anyone, no one could hurt me. But that's not freedom, that's just emptiness. So what is it? Rowan asked. Freedom. Alara thought about the garden she'd planted and the room Rowan had built, and the way Daniel looked at her like she mattered, about Ada and Claire and Fletcher and everyone who'd stood beside her when she'd needed them most. I think it's this, she said finally, knowing you have choices and people who'll support whatever you choose. Rowan nodded slowly. Yeah, I think you're right. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from truly knowing someone. And Alara realized that this moment, this life, this strange, broken, beautiful family was everything she'd been searching for. She'd run through a blizzard to escape a man who wanted to own her. She'd nearly died in the snow. She'd fought in court and testified and faced down every fear that had ever held her back. And she'd won. Not because the judge had ruled in her favor, not because Marcus had been arrested, but because she'd learned something that no one could ever take away from her. She'd learned that she was worth fighting for, that her life was her own, and that no matter how dark things got, there was always a choice, always a way forward. The snow kept falling, the fire kept burning, and Alara Voss, who'd once been ready to let the cold take her, sat warm and safe and free, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand with her. She'd survived. And more than that, she'd learned to live.